Hello there, folks, and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Global Summit 12 presentation of Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. I'm Ben Spigen, I'm the Vice President at the JES. In this program, which originally aired live on Wednesday, May 19th, 2021, Jefferson Educational Society Global Summit Chairman Steve Scully interviews Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today and author of Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power, about her best-selling book on the Speaker of the House. Before we get to the program, I'd like to thank all of our event sponsors: Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And I'd like to remind you that you can access additional programs to stream on demand at jeserie.org, where you'll also find a wide range of publications, from reports, essays, timely writings, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all JES content. And now, here's Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and the Lessons of Power.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Joyce Savacchio, Chairwoman of the Jefferson Education Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first ever Digital Global Summit Speaker Series. Tonight's guest, Susan Page, is one of the nation's most respected journalists and authors. The Jefferson was fortunate to meet her at a previous summit after the release of her critically acclaimed biography on Barbara Bush, aptly called Matriarch. Susan is back after the recent release of her soon-to-be next bestseller, Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. How good is Page's Pelosi book? Wrote one reviewer of the Washington Post, readers will put down the book with a much deeper understanding of and appreciation for the work it takes for a woman to harness, maintain, and wield authority that was once reserved exclusively for men. In her other lives, Susan Page is Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, and she is a frequent commentator and political analyst on national cable news shows. To help us gain a better understanding of Susan Page, her work, and her insights on Speaker Pelosi, I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight's program, C-SPAN Executive and Global Summit Chairman, Steve Scully.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce Savacchio, who, by the way, Susan Page is a former high school teacher of mine before she became the mayor of the great city of Erie. It is a great pleasure to welcome Susan Page back to Erie virtually. And as I think you'll find out, there are some similarities between Baltimore and Erie. We'll get to that, the political connections, the religious connections. Susan Page is also the moderator of the 2020 vice presidential debate. And like me, she's a graduate of Northwestern University. So thrilled to welcome you virtually back to Erie. Susan, let me begin with where your book begins. You talk about Nancy Pelosi being consequential and also complicated. Can you explain?
So, Steve, I'm going to start by doing what I've learned from politicians, which is answering the question I wish you had asked instead of the question that you did ask. Let me just say how pleased I am to be back, at least virtually, at the wonderful program that the Jefferson Educational Society sponsors. It was my privilege to be there 2 years ago in person, and I hope that next year you'll be able to go back to in-person programming for the wonderful series of authors you have coming up in future nights. And my thanks also to Joyce for her groundbreaking service as the first, and I think only female mayor of Erie. So it's a privilege to be hearing from her. And I would also have some questions for her about your history as a high school student. Perhaps we can talk later.
We'll do that offline.
just one more thing. I'm so glad to be here talking with my great friend, Steve Scully. It's a privilege to be here with you, Steve. So now let me answer the question that you actually asked. You know, Nancy Pelosi is complicated in that there are people who think she's fantastic. There are people who think she's quite terrible. She excites strong feelings on both sides of the aisle. She's kept Democrats united. She's done a lot to unify Republicans against her as well. And one of the things that was interesting to me about Pelosi is that she is a master of the inside game of politics, of cutting a deal, of pressuring a member to vote the way she wants him to. But even after all these decades in public office and as an elected official. She's still not very good at the outside game, at the public game, at giving a big speech or engaging in impromptu back and forth with reporters. So in that way, I thought she was worth taking a look.
There's so much in the book, and I'm going to go around to a couple of different points, but I was fascinated, and I didn't realize until I read your book that she actually ran to be the chair of the Democratic National Committee in 1984. She lost to Paul Kerr, but as you point out in the book, and as we often learn from defeat, you gain a lot of victories. So what did she learn from that defeat?
So she told me she learned much more from that defeat than from any of the other contests. It's the only time she lost an election was that bid to chair the DNC. She thought she was the strongest contender with the best record. She had taken over the California Democratic Party and led it to new victories. But she thought sexism was played a big role in her defeat. There were sexist attacks, including from the political director, the AFL-CIO. I can imagine how the AFL-CIO made up for that after she was elected the first woman Speaker of the House. They called her, they thought that she was ditzy, that she was a party girl, that she was an airhead. Now, Nancy Pelosi may be many things, good and bad, but an airhead she is not. So this defeat was a surprise to her. And among the lessons she took from it was to just ignore sexist attacks. After that race, when she showed and talked about the fact that she felt she was a victim of sexism, she stopped talking about it. It wasn't that she didn't face sexism in future contests, but it wasn't something she discussed in public. The other thing is she learned not to count on your friends to come through for you necessarily. Just because you thought somebody owed you a favor, do not assume that they're going to be with you. And when that, she was applying her number one lesson of power, something she had also learned from her father, the bigger than life mayor of Baltimore, which is no one is going to give you power. You have to take it. And after that election, she followed that lesson.
Well, that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about Baltimore and Erie. There are some real similarities. One of them is the Catholic tradition in the Erie community, certainly very strong in Baltimore as well. And we've been around Nancy Pelosi enough that she wears her religion on her sleeve. She has the ashes on Ash Wednesday. She talks about the rosary. She talks about going to daily mass as a communicant when she can. So address that if you would.
Yes, she grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, Little Italy in Baltimore. St. Leo's was the local parish and the center of community activities where babies got baptized and little children went to parochial school and couples got married and people were mourned when they died. So very much a Catholic place. Ethnic, Little Italy, obviously heavily Italian, but lots of ethnic enclaves around Little Italy that made up the coalition that supported her father first during 5 terms in the U.S. House and then 3 terms at City Hall.
And of course, Erie with a lot of ethnic communities. You mentioned her dad, Tommy D'Alessandro. Erie had Lou Tullio, an Italian mayor who served 5 terms as the mayor of the city of Erie. Nancy Pelosi's father comes through so strongly in your reporting and book. So elaborate a bit more about the influence he had on her with 5 boys, and yet she's the one that really carried on the political mantle. Even though some of the kids were active in Baltimore politics, she carried it to a new level. Right.
Tommy D'Alessandro Jr., he was kicked out of St. Leo's school when he was 13 years old. He never went back to get a degree anywhere. The nun who kicked him out finally invited him back when he had been elected to Congress and had a little ceremony where they gave him his elementary school diploma that he had not gotten the first time around. But he was a natural Paul. He was a guy with a big personality and a zest for politics, and especially for city politics. He loved being mayor more than he did being a member of Congress, a big ally of FDR, so loyal to FDR that he named his first son after himself, Tommy D'Alessandro III. He named his second son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt D'Alessandro, which is kind of a mouthful. And as you say, neither Tommy D'Alessandro nor Nancy Pelosi thought there was any possibility she would be the one who would follow her father into politics, that there was any possibility she would ever be an elected office herself. Her oldest brother served one term as mayor of Baltimore, but it's really Nancy Pelosi who's carried on the political tradition of her dad and also of her mother, who was known as Big Nancy to distinguish her from her daughter, Little Nancy.
What did he teach her about the art of politics? What did Nancy Pelosi tell you about what her father taught her? Besides, you mentioned before about, when you have power and authority.
Right. Well, taught her to go after power. If you want power, don't step back because you'll never get it unless you step forward yourself. Her dad first got elected to Congress by challenging a 6-term Democratic incumbent in the House. You can imagine how bloody that primary was. It was a guy who lived around the corner from him in Little Italy, but he out-organized him and out-defeated him. Father was big into local community organizing, and so was her mother. And her mother kept what they called the favor file. And the favor file was just exactly what it sounds like it was. People would line up over at their house in Little Italy with various problems, with housing problem or an immigration problem, or maybe a son had gone to jail and they were trying to figure out how to deal with that. And Mrs. D'Alessandro would write down on a card the favor that they needed. She would listen to their problem, figure out how they might be able to help, the favor that was granted. And then when election time came around, these people would be expected, of course, to show up and vote for them, having gotten a favor. And she would also, if you'd gotten a favor from the D'Alessandro machine, and there was somebody down the line who needed a favor you might be able to help with, they would come back to you and ask for your help. It is a classic definition of politics. It is not that different from what Nancy Pelosi has done all these years as leader of Democrats in the House.
She meets her soon-to-be husband, Paul, moves out to San Francisco, and then gets involved in California politics. And you can appreciate this. So, by the way, has 5 children. As a mom yourself, you know what that's like.
Yeah, she had 5 children in 6 years and a week, which is something she once described as the Catholic way. So a lot of kids really fast. And, it's interesting. We talked about her dad as being somebody who taught her about politics, about being a political leader. She says that being the mother of 5 kids was also great training to be Speaker of the House. Because you think about it, you're dealing with constant chaos. You're trying to impose order. You've got all these people with grievances, real or imagined. You're dealing with shifting coalitions in a big family like that, same as in the House of Representatives. So she says she really learned the skills that have made her successful as Speaker of the House during those years when she had all those kids at home.
How influential was California Governor Jerry Brown early in her career back in the 1970s?
So she was very impressed early on with Jerry Brown during his first time as governor of California. He was a frequent visitor to her house. She was already at that point a pretty successful political fundraiser. And then he decides that he's going to run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1976. He decided this pretty late in the game. Jimmy Carter was already out there, had been working on this for a year or more. It was Nancy Pelosi who said to Jerry Brown, "You should run in the Maryland primary." And this was not because Maryland was so crazy for Jerry Brown. It was because Nancy Pelosi had a brother who was a former mayor. She had a close friend who was head of the the county council. She had all these political connections that succeeded in delivering the Maryland presidential primary to Jerry Brown, much to the chagrin of the Carter folks who were at that point rolling toward the Democratic nomination.
When did you first meet Nancy Pelosi?
Wow. I've been covering her for the 100 years I've been in Washington. I was actually in Washington before she was. That's how long I've been around. But I don't think I ever interviewed her until she was the leader of House Democrats. I'd interviewed her a couple times over the years. She's a tough interview. I don't know if you'd agree with me on that, Steve.
Oh, yeah.
Has that been your experience as well?
Yes, she's very hard. And often the best interview is after the cameras are off and you're like, can we go back on camera? Because it's really good stuff.
She's very disciplined. And
yes.
guarded and private. And that is exactly not what you want in somebody you're interviewing. You want somebody who's spontaneous and unguarded and vulnerable. And those are not the words you would use for Nancy Pelosi. But she did get, I ended up with 10 interviews with her for the book. And she did get a little more candid the more often we met.
And the most candid included what?
Well, I think the most candid interview was, these interviews, of course, would be scheduled well in advance. And I happened to have an interview on the day that the Democratic caucus really blew up over AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the squad defecting from the Democratic line on an immigration bill, and then attacking Chief of Staff to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, then attacking in a tweet other Democratic members of the House. This was a firestorm. And my interview with Pelosi was shortly after that meeting ended. And so when she came into the interview, she was pretty wound up. And I was asking her about what this meant, this split in the caucus. And at first she was saying, there's no split, it's the press is hyping this. But then I asked her, made a comparison that she has herself made. I said, do the members of the squad understand the difference between making a fine pate and making sausage? Because one of Pelosi's lines is, it'd be great to make a fine pate, but most of the time up here, we're making sausage, meaning it is messy and it involves sometimes difficult compromises. And then she got about as candid as she ever got in any interview I had with her. And she said that, yes, they didn't understand the difference, that they would learn when they actually had something they wanted to get done. And then she quoted Dave Obey, who had been chairman of the Appropriations Committee years before. Dave Obey had a saying that some people come to Washington to pose for holy pictures and show, look how pure I am. And other people come to Washington to actually get something done. And to Nancy Pelosi, the idea that you came to Washington to pose for holy pictures, that was not a compliment.
Well, that's you have this in the book about her reaction to Chuck Schumer. Let me just pull it up. We can come here to do a job, not to keep a job, regarding the Affordable Care Act.
That's right, because Schumer had expressed some regret about the fact that the passage of the Affordable Care Act had been damaging for Democrats in that midterm election in 2010. Democrats lost control of Congress with that. And she rebuked him and said that it was basically that it was an achievement that was worth doing despite the political costs.
So bear with me. I hope this was going to come across from October of 2019. This picture says all you need to know about Nancy Pelosi. Explain.
So this was supposed to be a meeting on Syria, and the bipartisan congressional leaders are there. The president is there. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is sitting next to the president. But it quickly becomes a meeting about impeachment, and that the conversation between President Trump and Speaker Pelosi became quite sharp. You see Nancy Pelosi in that picture standing up at the cabinet table, jabbing her finger at the president. These are not pictures that you ever see of the presidents and speakers of the House. You see all the men around the table, they seem to be looking at their shoes. General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it looks like he's praying. It's just an extraordinary confrontation. Nancy Pelosi then leads a walkout of Democratic congressional leaders from this meeting. And that was the last time Nancy Pelosi and President Trump ever had a conversation. October 2019. Think about more than a year and several months still left in his term. They never again had a conversation.
What struck me is an interview that I did with her in April of 2020, basically saying that Donald Trump is irrelevant. He's still the president of the United States. As you pointed out, there was no relationship.
Yeah. And even at the very end of Trump's presidency, when the White House and the Congress were negotiating big COVID relief package, remember, significant amounts of money, it was all done through the Treasury Secretary, not involving the president, because there was no relationship between Pelosi and Trump.
I also found it interesting. You point out in the book, she was elected. It was a special election in 1987, an open seat in San Francisco. And if I'm not mistaken, she was going to stay for 10 years, 5 years. What changed?
So her dad had been here in Washington for 5 terms. She said she thought that made some sense. Actually, when I interviewed Paul Pelosi, her husband, he also said, yeah, they had thought 5 terms, 10 years. That sounds about right. But she liked it, and she was really good at it. This was the first time she had been in public office, not as a party leader, and she discovered that it really went to her skills. And others also identified her early on as somebody with big prospects. Chuck Schumer, who is of course now the Senate Majority Leader, was a member of the House at the time, and he was a participant in a Tuesday night dinner group of young liberal Democratic House members. And George Miller, who was then a congressman from California, brought Pelosi soon after her initial election to this Tuesday night dinner group. And as he introduced, George Miller introduced Pelosi to Schumer. Schumer told me that George Miller said to him, she'll be speaker one day.
She's also a pretty good cook.
Who, Schumer?
No. Nancy Pelosi.
Is Nancy Pelosi a good cook? Really?
Oh, you've never been? Yeah, she's a phenomenal cook. She is a great. She could be an Italian chef. She knows how to cook a good meal, and she's done that in the past with some of her conference members. So let's go back to November 8th, 2016, and you begin the book by pointing out that she is convinced Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president. Walk us through that day, in the evening, into the next day.
Of course, she was not the only one in Washington and the country who had assumed Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. She said she was confident that that was going to happen. Unknown to most people, she had begun to make plans to step down after Hillary Clinton's election. She was at that point 76 years old. Any place but Capitol Hill, that'd be retirement age. She felt that President Hillary Clinton would protect Democratic priorities, most especially the Affordable Care Act. So she does an appearance on the NewsHour with Judy Woodruff, in which she espouses great confidence. She goes to a watch party for big donors. She then talks to Bob Brady, who's an old-time Paul from Philadelphia. He was then a member of Congress, although he's not in Congress anymore, and to check out on how the votes were going. And he said, well, first time they talked, he said, it's fine, we're doing great in Philadelphia. Philadelphia will offset the more Republican votes in other parts of the state. You may be familiar with some of those parts he was talking about. The second time they talked that night, he was less confident. The third time he said, it's not going to happen. We're losing Pennsylvania. And Pelosi knew at that point, losing Pennsylvania, Trump was going to win the election. Everything had changed. By the end of the night, she had decided she wasn't going anywhere. She was going to stick around and stand up to this disruptive new president.
Did they at any point have a productive relationship, or was it sour at the very beginning? I'm talking specifically about Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi.
So they had a little bit of a relationship. She had once gone and gotten a campaign contribution from him back in the days when he was a Democrat. Trump continued to believe until that first impeachment that they could do business, that they were fellow deal makers. He was more solicitous of Pelosi than he was of most other Democrats, even of some Republicans that he would tack those insulting monikers on his Twitter feed. He didn't really do that with Pelosi until impeachment. And in fact, I interviewed Trump in the fall of 2018, right before the midterm election. I interviewed him for USA Today, and he was not that alarmed by the idea that Democrats might get control of the House, making Pelosi speaker, because he thought they could get a deal on things like maybe an infrastructure bill. But of course, the Democrats did win control of the House. That opened up a lot of investigations of President Trump and eventually led to him being impeached not once, but twice.
And what was Nancy Pelosi's relationship like with Barack Obama?
So she was very much admired Barack Obama. She appreciated the fact that he pursued the Affordable Care Act when it wasn't guaranteed that it was going to pass. That was a tough fight. She admired his intellect. She sometimes thought he wasn't a very good Paul. And when after the Affordable Care Act was passed, she felt that he didn't do enough to explain to Americans why this was a good thing that was going to benefit them in their lives. And she thinks that played a part in those big Democratic setbacks in 2010.
In fact, as you point out in the book, one thing she knows how to do is to count votes. The ACA won by 4 votes.
So I said to her, you know, the ACA won by 4 votes. And she said, well, I had a couple in my pocket. She said, you don't go to the floor for a big vote like that without having a little bit of an insurance policy. So she had several Democratic members of Congress who wanted to vote against it. But if she had to have their vote, they would have voted for it.
And we saw that today as well when the House of Representatives passing the January 6th commission with 35 Republican votes. But let's talk about this because it is in the news. It's so relevant to where we're at. I want to first ask you where you were the afternoon of January 6th and how you witnessed the events as they unfolded.
Well, I was working from my home, as I've been doing during the pandemic, and watching with astonishment at what we were seeing on television and talking to editors in my office about how we were going to go about covering this extraordinary event. I've got to say, you know, I've been fortunate to cover a lot of big events in Washington over the years. I've never covered anything like the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. And we still don't know everything about that event. And as you said, the House has now passed today, just an hour or so ago, passed authorization for a 9/11 style commission. That is not likely to go through in the Senate. It looks like it's going to be a very uphill battle in the Senate to establish this commission. But Pelosi told me a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed her that she had the alternative of appointing a select committee like the Benghazi committee to pursue this if they were unable to get a commission established. And I think that now looks like the likely option.
I wonder though, Susan Page, did Speaker Pelosi overplay her hand? Because initially it was a heavily Democratic commission and then they agreed to have it 50-50. Why not do that at the outset to take the politics, even at the starting gate, out of this debate?
Well, if you were asking Pelosi that and she was being honest, she would probably say you don't start out with the negotiating position you plan to end up with, right? You start out with some things that you're willing to give up. I think what the initial proposal for the commission did not look very balanced. And it was easy for Republicans to reject it. And I think what she then decided to do was to take away the things that Republicans were objecting to and leave it to the one critical matter, which was the scope of the investigation. And that was the nub of the controversy between the two sides, because Democrats want an investigation into January 6th, into that event. And Republicans have talked about a much broader inquiry that would look at civil violence after some of the George Floyd marches last year. So anyway, I think that's the history of how they ended up where she made some real concessions, you know, in the proposal that the House passed today, even divide between Republicans and Democrats, and no subpoena can be issued by Democrats alone. It would have to be bipartisan, but it just doesn't look like to me like that's going to get through the Senate.
So what does that tell you about the state of American politics, the state of politics here in Washington and in Congress in particular? Well,
we're pretty much frozen into camps. But one thing was interesting, 35 Republicans voted in favor of this commission. That's a significant number. In a party, you know, we see so much party discipline on almost everything. For almost 36 Republican House members to defy their leadership was whipping against this vote, whereas the leadership was encouraging members to oppose this measure. I thought that was interesting. And to some, it indicates that maybe possibly you could get the 10 Senate Republicans you need to get it through, to get it past a filibuster in the Senate. But 10 is a big number. So we'll see.
And you have to wonder if those 7 Republicans who voted to convict Trump will be there, plus, as you indicated, 3 more. We're here to talk about Speaker Pelosi, but I do have to ask you about Leader Kevin McCarthy, because what a 14 days he has had dealing with this today, those 35 Republican votes, and of course the ouster of Liz Cheney last week, which again shines a light into the role that Donald Trump has on the GOP and some real problems that he's going to face, even though the Republicans look as if they have a good shot of regaining the House next year.
That's right. History says Kevin McCarthy should be Speaker of the House after the next midterm elections, but he's had some terrible problems and not handled them, I think, that deftly. I mean, they ousted Liz Cheney because she insisted on articulating the accurate statement about what happened on January 6th. He cited about what happened on January 6th, and also in the election, she said that the election was not stolen by Joe Biden, that he's legitimately elected president. And for that, she was ousted from the Republican leadership. And now he's had 35 members defy him on this vote today. He was initially, right after January 6th, critical. He went to the floor to criticize President Trump for his role in that riot. And then not too much longer, he was down in Mar-a-Lago kissing Trump's ring. So he has, I think, some real political challenges. And they start with Donald Trump, who, even though he was defeated as president, continues to be the dominant face of the Republican Party.
Just as a quick aside, the relationship between Steny Hoyer of Maryland and Nancy Pelosi.
So their relationship at the moment, I think, is good. I think they've come around to a productive working relationship, but their relationship in the past has been really bitter. Here's some ancient history. So in 2001, and even before that, Steny Hoyer thought he was on track to become the next Democratic whip, to get into the senior leadership of the party. And along came Nancy Pelosi, who announced her own campaign for that job. This was really disruptive. She was ignoring kind of the regular order of things. And she made the point that if you left it to the regular order, women would never get anywhere, that the leadership in both parties, including in the Democratic Party, was 100% male in senior jobs. So they fought a titanic battle. They raised and contributed millions of dollars in campaign funds to try to get the votes of members. When the vote was finally held soon after the 9/11 attack, so about 20 years ago, Pelosi won, not by much, but she won that election, and she has been one step above Steny Hoyer ever since.
And I hope that Mayor Joyce Savacchio is watching, because I think she's reflected that same tenacity and same sheer determination to break those glass ceilings. I want to get to questions from the audience, and again remind our viewers that Susan Page was in Erie for the Global Summit in 2019, so she certainly knows a little bit about our great community, and I want to thank you again for doing this. I'm curious the process of writing this book, because it came on the heels of your best-selling book on Barbara Bush, which I want to talk about in just a moment, and you spoke about that when you were in Erie in November of 2019 to turn around and then put this project together.
Well, I'd never written a book before the Barbara Bush book, and I really liked it. It was really satisfying. You talked at the leaders of the Jefferson Educational Society talked about the delights of a deep dive into a topic. And while I love being a daily news reporter, and we have done it for decades, it was very satisfying to explore one person's interesting life in depth. And so when I finished the Barbara Bush book, I thought that was fun. I would like to do that again. And Nancy Pelosi presented herself as someone who had not been the subject of a full-scale biography that I thought was three-dimensional, and somebody who was going to be in a position of real power for these last 2 years of Donald Trump's term.
So let's get to some questions. One is, will Speaker Pelosi actually step down from the speaker in 2022?
So that's a great question, and there are many Democratic members of Congress who would like to know. Just for some background, when Pelosi had a reasonably serious challenge to her position as Speaker in 2018, after the 2018 midterms. And at that point, she made an offer that she would only serve 2 more terms as Speaker. And they elected her with this wasn't written into the rules. It's not a law. You can't arrest her if she chooses not to do it. But she did say then that just 2 more terms, and therefore she would be in her last term. Now, at the beginning of this year, she was asked if that promise still applied, and she indicated that it did, although she has not made the kind of Sherman-esque statement that everybody could hang their hat on. So the answer is, I think so, but it's not guaranteed.
Get a drink of water if you have the water with you. And this is my question, not from a viewer, but do you think there's any chance that she would step down at the end of this year, before 2022, to take her name out of the equation in the midterm elections?
I think it's possible. And here's how I think it would work. The legislative business is likely to happen this year. It'll be hard to have it happen in an election year. So a less appealing year to be around. It's always seemed to me that it's possible she would close her career by serving as ambassador to Italy or to the Vatican. Excuse me. And if she did that, President Biden might appoint her to that, and she might take that job for this last, for not this year, but next year, for 2022. It would also remove for Republicans somebody they have really vilified for decades, very effectively so in a lot of ads. So I think it's speculation. I don't have reporting that says that might happen, but I think it is conceivable. You can make the case for it.
Take a sip of the Coca-Cola. Let me just reintroduce Susan Page, who has spent many years with USA Today, serving as the Washington bureau chief for the newspaper and usatoday.com. She has been on many programs, including Fox News Sunday and C-SPAN. And she's a dear friend, and I'm really thrilled to spend this time with her. Her second best-selling book on Nancy Pelosi, and your first book on Barbara Bush, tomorrow night, and I'll bring the book over here. Sorry, this is Karen Tumblty's book on Nancy Reagan. I know the answer to this question, but share the insight. What was the relationship like between Barbara Bush and Reagan?
First of all, let me say how great Karen's book is. It's such a wonderful, wonderfully written and really deeply reported about a woman who I think has not been well understood. So lucky, your audience is lucky to have a chance to hear from her tomorrow. Their relationship could not have been worse. They really disliked each other. They disliked each other from the moment they met, because their husbands were running against one another for the presidential nomination in 1980. I can tell you from the reporting out the Barbara Bush book, which included a series of interviews with her in the final 6 months of her life, that she thought Nancy Pelosi was pretentious and impossible, and she could not understand her dysfunctional family, the Bush family, very close, always had children and grandchildren around. The Reagan family, quite dysfunctional. And Barbara Bush also thought Nancy Reagan was mean to her in ways large and small. And she told me about when they finally left the White House, the Bushes did, having lost to Bill Clinton, that 2 or 3 days later, she had her final conversation with Nancy. Nancy Reagan had called to explain away some offense. And Barbara Bush said, "I never want to speak with you again." And then said, "Oh, my other phone is ringing," which is not true, and hung up. And that was the last time they talked. That tells you everything you need to know about their relationship.
Well, this is a great tease for tomorrow with Karen Tumblty. So I'm hoping that those of you part of this virtual summit tune in tomorrow. And then in the fall, Anita McBride is putting together a First Ladies panel in conjunction with the White House Historical Association. And so another good look, insight into the First Ladies. So back to some of the questions here. Over the course of 10 interviews, over the course of 10 interviews with the speaker, what was one thing you uncovered that thought would surprise readers? And what's one thing that genuinely surprised you?
Well, first, let me tell you how the first interview began, which was, I had no arrangement with her when I signed the contract to write the book about whether she would cooperate. And I'm not sure that was a smart thing to do, but the reason I did that was because if I asked her in advance and she said no, maybe I would chicken out. And if I asked her in advance and she said yes, maybe she would think that gave her some say over what I was going to write. And I didn't want to do an authorized biography. I wanted to do a work of journalism. So I signed the contract to write this book. I seek an interview. They agree to one interview. We don't have any commitment for more than that. So I'm trying to make a very good impression, right? So I go to the speaker's office with its really, I know you've been there, Steve. It's got the most magnificent view of the National Mall that you can imagine. And she offers me a Dove bar. Now, she's a big chocoholic. So being offered a Dove bar by Nancy Pelosi is quite the good omen. I thought, I bite into the Dove bar and I spread little shards of chocolate all over her pristine carpet. The Dove bar just disintegrates. And so there I am frantically trying to pick up melting pieces of chocolate while she gives me a look, which I can only describe as the look of a mother, and not in a good way. And I thought, she is never going to let me come back. And in fact, she did let me come back 9 more times. But, Steve, she never again served me any food.
Or ice cream. She's a big ice cream aficionado. This is from, I feel like I'm on C-SPAN, a viewer from Long Island, New York. So thank you for watching outside of Erie. This is Pelosi's likely final term as speaker. How does she feel about leaving the ship as it steers into some very uncharted political and troubling waters?
Yeah, it'll be tough for the next Democratic leader. Maybe not a speaker, right? Maybe the Democrats will be in the minority then. I think she feels like I know she believes she's done a good job. She certainly has kept her party together through some difficult times, but the party is shifting to the left. Its majority is gotten to be the narrowest in modern times. There are divisions about all kinds of things, including the Green New Deal and Medicare for all. And as we've seen in the past few days, over what to do about violence in the Middle East. So that'll be a task for the next speaker. But I do think she feels proud of what she's achieved. And one thing I concluded after doing the research for this book was, a lot of Americans think, oh, Nancy Pelosi, she'll be in the history books because she's the first woman speaker. And she will be in the history books for that, but she'll also be in the history books because she is the most consequential speaker since the legendary Sam Rayburn. She has held on to power for almost 20 years through majority status and minority status. She has been the crucial figure in passage of the Affordable Care Act, in passage of the financial bailout in 2008 that was politically quite unpopular, but may have prevented another Great Depression. She would be in the history books if she were male, not just because she's female.
Another question. I attended the same college as Nancy Pelosi, Trinity College, an all-female institution. Has she ever said that her all-female education was instrumental in her career?
She speaks so favorably and with such affection about her years at Trinity College, now Trinity University. And I went up there. I interviewed a nun who had taught her. I sat down with, I interviewed 3 of her college classmates, including interviewing her college roommate on the phone. So she was a product of all girls schools, not just in college, but also in elementary and high school at the Institute of Notre Dame in Baltimore. Another graduate of the Institute of Notre Dame, just 4 years ahead of her, was Barbara Mikulski, who became the longest serving woman in the history of Congress. She retired a couple years ago as senator from Maryland. And when I interviewed Mikulski, she made the case about the power of all girls schools because girls fill all the leadership positions. They maybe feel less pressure to not speak up, to not seem bossy. There is some evidence, I think, when you look at women who have succeeded in American politics, a lot of them did go to all girls schools at one point or another, including, of course, Hillary Clinton, who went to Wellesley.
And of course, Erie is going through a transition. My own wife attended an all-girls high school, and now it's merging with the all-boys high school, and so it will be a co-ed in about 2 years. So a lot of transitions, a sad chapter for those who enjoyed going to the same school. I concur with this question or comment. Not all journalists make for good book writers, and not all book writers make for good journalists. You're great at both. Keep Susan Page's success.
Well, that's so nice. Thank you very much. And that was probably from my cousin. Thank you, cousin.
But what is the key to success?
Well, that's a very big question. I mean, I think there are some things that are the same, whether you're writing a book or a newspaper article on the fly. One is to pay attention, to listen carefully, to recognize shades of gray, not just black and white, to be curious about things, and to not to assume you know too much. I think the times when I've done the worst articles are the ones when I thought I knew everything going in.
Another question. You did a great job as the moderator of the vice presidential debate. Did you see the fly on Mike head?
I did not see the fly, and Mike Pence was also unaware of the fly. And so the debate is over, and Kamala Harris goes off in one direction off stage, and Vice President Pence goes the other direction off stage. And I wait a minute, and then I go off stage, and I happen to go in the direction that Pence went. And his kids were backstage. They had been watching in the hall to tell him about this enormous fly that landed on his head and stayed there like forever. But he and I could not understand what they were talking about. It was such a mystery. And when I saw the video, I could not, but number one, it was the world's biggest fly. It looked like a drone, and it stayed on his head forever. So I'm proud to say that I moderated the fly debate.
Another question going back to Speaker Pelosi's faith, simply saying, how did her faith affect her political career, her Catholic faith?
Well, that's a fair question. She talks a lot about her faith. She's pretty serious about her faith. But I'm not sure I know how it's affected it. She's got her strength in I'm just trying to think about how it might have affected it. Her strength in San Francisco kind of crosses religious and ethnic lines, right? She has a kind of traditional Democratic coalition there. She did get in that very first election, the special election you mentioned in 1987. She did rely on support. She did work hard to get support from the Italian American community in San Francisco. That was one source of strength for her. That was a wild primary. 14 people in that primary. Pelosi was not the favored candidate. She was not. There were several much more experienced public officials, including 3 members of the city council in the Council of Supervisors in San Francisco. That was one wild race. And one interesting thing about it, one of the things, her main opponent was Harry Britt, who was a groundbreaking gay politician in San Francisco. And he was going to get, she knew, heavy support from the most liberal precincts of the city. And so she did campaigning, sent out flyers in the Republican precincts. And her basic pitch was, a Democrat's going to win this contest. You might as well vote for the Democrat you like best, or maybe the Democrat you dislike least, the candidate you dislike least, or the Democrat you like best. And on the night of that primary, she lost the most solidly Democratic precincts. It was supported more Republican precincts that got her over the finish line in that important first contest.
Another good question. These have all been great questions. Behind the scenes, behind closed doors, do Republicans respect Nancy Pelosi for the power and the grip that she's had on her?
So again, these questions are just so smart. So you have a very smart audience. That's a great question. I interviewed Newt Gingrich, the former Republican Speaker of the House. Now, he and Nancy Pelosi have fought over everything. It's hard to think of a policy on which they might have agreed. And yet he said to me that he admired her political skill. And he said, sometimes you look across the ocean and you say, there's a fellow pirate. And when I look at Nancy Pelosi, I see a fellow pirate, meaning he and Nancy Pelosi had similar political skills, the skills of pirates. And I thought that was pretty high praise from Newt Gingrich for Nancy Pelosi.
Two final questions. How has Nancy Pelosi been able to hold her grip on power? And just take that a little bit further, because she does understand, to go back to your point, the favor file. She knows what her members need, and she knows old school politics still works in the 21st century.
You know, our friend John Bresnahan, who now works, veteran congressional correspondent, worked for Politico, now works for Punchbowl News. He did a profile of Nancy Pelosi 11 years ago that had a phrase in it that I love. He said, she is an iron fist in a Gucci glove. Nancy Pelosi is an iron fist in a Gucci glove. And when she's playing the favor file, it's the Gucci glove. It's, here's a favor I did for you. Here's something you really need. I can do this for you. But when she needs to get a hard vote through over the finish line, she uses that iron fist. So I think that members of both parties view her both with enormous respect and with a certain amount of fear.
Another picture from the book with one of the questions. I'm going to show it here, if I can. The State of the Union speech. See that? Did Nancy Pelosi, one of the viewers, did she intend to rip up the speech? And what does this picture tell you about Pelosi and Trump?
So this is a picture after actually the 2019 State of the Union, the one we're seeing, which is where she gave the kind of clap that looks sarcastic. But elsewhere on that page, I think, is a picture of her tearing up the speech. Do you see that? That picture is also, yes. And that was a year later in 2020. And I interviewed her about this at some length because I thought it was one of the most extraordinary things I had ever seen. Yes, exactly. The Speaker of the House tearing up the text of the State of the Union address while the president's in front of her. Can you believe that? I couldn't believe it that night when I saw it happen. And I asked her if she meant to do that, if she walked in saying, planning this is a kind of protest. And she said, no, she said, the problem was I couldn't find a pen. That she was reading that when the president arrives, he traditionally gives the Speaker of the House the text of his speech before a State of the Union address. Trump did that. She was reading through it quickly and she saw something she thought was inaccurate and she wanted to mark it so she could get back to it, but she couldn't find a pen to make the mark. And she didn't, I guess you don't carry your purse up with you when you're Speaker of the House to the dais for a State of the Union address. The big desk in front of her had a drawer. She opens a drawer, it's empty, no pen. So she makes a tiny, tiny little tear in the margin of the text so that she could find her place later where there was this thing she thought was untrue. And then she found something else she thought was untrue and she made another little tear. And then she found something else she thought was untrue and made another little tear. And by the end of the speech, the margin was just a series of little tears. And then Trump delivered the Presidential Medal of Freedom, announced it for Rush Limbaugh, who was sitting with Melania Trump in the First Lady's box. And that really steamed Democrats because they thought it wasn't an appropriate setting to do that. And especially to Rush Limbaugh, who was a figure who had derided so many Democrats. So the speech ends, she's pretty mad. She's told me she thought, well, if he's going to shred the truth, I'm going to shred his speech. And she stands up and tears the speech in half and tosses it on the desk in front of her. And my favorite part of that picture is Mike Pence standing next to her, pretending he cannot see what's going on.
Interesting too, because earlier in the day, the president had that luncheon with network anchors. And when he told us that he was going to give Rush Limbaugh the Medal of Freedom, it was just one of those stunning moments that you just, and that was the big surprise, one of the big surprises of the night.
So Steve, you were at that. I would love to have been invited to that lunch. I never was, with the network of anchors. So did he talk about Pelosi at all during that event?
He did, but not in any great length. It was obviously before the speech was ripped up. But in 2018, after the impeachment, he was with us. And it was interesting. Do you remember the speech he gave on immigration? The speech of the nation? And so separate luncheon, and I sat next to Jared Kushner. And what's fascinating about that is that we said to him, "Why are you giving the speech?" He goes, "I don't know. They told me to give the speech. I don't think it's going to make a difference, but I'm going to give the speech," which goes back to your point that he was totally candid and honest. No scripted answers from him. He just called it like he saw them.
Yeah, he's the reverse kind of interview from Nancy Pelosi.
Final question from one of our viewers. Do you have a third book in you?
So I hope so, because it's just been a real privilege and pleasure to write these two. And I am in search of a topic. So if you have an idea, just please shoot it my way. spage@usatoday.com. I would love to hear your idea.
And hopefully we can get you back to Erie. Susan Page, who is the Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. 2 great books, one on Barbara Bush, the matriarch, and of course her new book, Madam Speaker, both in the New York Times bestseller list. So generous with your time when in Erie and now virtually. Susan Page, a huge thanks.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Thanks so much.
And absolutely.
Back to you.
To our guest tonight, Miss Susan Page, author of Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power, and the award-winning Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today. Thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. And of course, as always, a big thanks to Mr. Steve Scully, the chairman of the JES's Global Summit Speaker Series, for moderating tonight's lively and thought-provoking and fun conversation. And of course, thanks goes out to our entire JES team under the leadership of our president, Dr. Ferki Faradi, and to the JES Board of Trustees under the leadership of our chairwoman, Joyce Savacchio, and to all of our event sponsors, Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and to our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And of course, to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. These programs and discussions and exchange of information and ideas and possible third book ideas would not be possible without you. Folks, for more information about the JES, including how to register for additional Global Summit events, which you see on your screen right now, please visit jeserie.org. There you'll also find details on how to purchase Madam Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power, the terrific book you heard about tonight, along with videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand and publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information about other JES initiatives such as our Civic Leadership Academy and Ramey Fellows program. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spegin. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.